Mark Samuel is a thought leader and CEO of Impact, an award-winning international consulting firm that guides organizations in achieving measurable breakthrough results within 6 months or less through a unique system that links execution, culture, and deliverables. Mark is the best-selling author of the acclaimed Creating the Accountable Organization and the award-winning book, Making Yourself Indispensable, The Power of Personal Accountability. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Kameen, and welcome everybody who has taken time out of your busy day to be on this call. I really appreciate it, and I'm excited about sharing some of these concepts about organizational change and really approaching change from a new paradigm. I have set up, if you will, kind of a purpose for this webinar. First, just provide ideas for having a great 2013. In my mind, we've got a lot of challenges ahead of us and a lot of change going on in most organizations I'm working with, and yet I see this as a real opportunity if we can approach it differently to have literally a great 2013. And while my webinar will be focused mostly on organizations, I actually do think, and organizational change, I do think that it also applies to personal change. And I'm going to make that clear by the very end of the webinar when we talk about the tips for taking action in 2013. One of the parts of the webinar that I'm excited about as well is to review some of the common traps that we've been seeing in organizations who are making major change efforts. I find that it's really us that gets in the way a lot of times, whether that's personal change or it's organizational change. It's sometimes our old habits, sometimes our mindset about change. I find it for myself personally, but I find some common practices that are just simply not working in organizations, that if we can change those and eliminate those or replace them with other ways of doing things, that we could get better results. I want to also discuss, with that said, some of our latest discoveries about achieving sustainable change. And to me, this is a real critical factor. I see a lot of organizations making changes, but they're not necessarily sustainable. It's almost like it, lasts for a while, and then we seem to go back to old ways of doing things. And what can we do to actually sustain a change and make it more long-lasting in addition to optimizing them? Want to provide some sample of the concepts covered in the Rapid Culture Change Public Workshop. I mean, to be honest with you, I don't typically do a lot of webinars, but I had a number of people when we put out the last notice about the Rapid Culture Change program in January. I had a number of people ask me about the program and wanting to know about some of the concepts, and I thought, well, why not put a webinar out that actually provides people a snapshot of the program, gives you some value, and yet, for those of you who are interested in really going deeper, there is the opportunity in January to take this 3-day workshop, which is a highly intensive program, and I'll explain a little bit more about that towards the end of the webinar, and really give you an opportunity to explore that as a possibility. I will be providing time for Q&A, as Kameen mentioned. There's a set time for it at the end, but I do welcome questions all along the way, and as we go from section to section, I might stop and just see if there's any questions to be answered that you might have. So please feel free to type those in for us, and we'll handle them as they come. The end of the program, the end of the webinar, I've got tips for taking action in 2013. These are very practical things that you can do to set up your change efforts for 2013 in your organization. But you'll also notice that as I go through each of those steps, that there's a way in which I've geared them so that if you're making personal changes, my personal change for 2013 is going to be improving my health yet again, and see how I can make that more sustainable through some of the ideas that we're going to be talking about here. So whatever your focus is personally, I welcome that you look at that and apply it at that time as well. So you just want to make sure this is going to come at the very end of the webinar, so you want to make sure to catch that as well. So what were some of the common challenges that we've seen, you know, that will face us in 2013? And this may not fit you perfectly. You know, some of you may resonate with all of these, some of these, and maybe you have different ones. So I really welcome you to look at this and even add in any that we don't mention. But one of them that I'm seeing blatantly, and it's been, you know, 2012 is the same thing, more priorities and less resources. We've just got so many more things on our plate that we need to accomplish, and yet we don't have the resources to do them. I'm seeing a major cut. In fact, in one organization I was working with, they actually are in a great position that they are at full capacity. They're selling everything they're making as a manufacturing plant. And that's a great position to be in. In fact, you know, they can't even fulfill all the orders. So they got approval from corporate to invest a huge amount of money in building out their capacity and literally, you know, increasing capacity by a significant amount with a multiple $million-dollar investment to make that happen. And what was most fascinating to me was when I was talking to the senior leadership team, even though they're making this huge investment in increasing capacity with new equipment and all of that new technology, they are literally not adding one single headcount to their organization. And I think that's one of the challenges. You know, obviously that's a challenge in the U.S. for our job market, but I think it's one of the challenges that we have in terms of dealing with change going forward in 2013. There's just more and more change, and after we're done with that change, there's even more change after that. So it's, you know, it's this never-ending cycle that we have to deal with. I think there's another issue that's surfacing, and that's an aging workforce. And with that, in a sense, is the knowledge that leaves when those people leave. Because I'm finding a number of organizations have very experienced, very, you know, competent people that are close to retirement, and there's no real documentation. There's no way to if you will, to pass on their knowledge efficiently and effectively to the next generation. And I think that's a challenge that we're going to be having to deal with as leaders who've been around forever are leaving, you know, open positions and knowledge deficit going forward. At the same time, there's a whole new workforce coming in with completely different values and different habits of interaction and execution. They're, you know, they don't use the phone as much. They've been brought up using, you know, the computer and chatting and emailing as a way of communicating. Well, that becomes very difficult when you're dealing with communication breakdowns or conflicts or things of that nature. And again, there's a whole different value about even, you know, what, you know, about the workforce, about the work in general. You know, for instance, I know a lot of IT young people who are entering the workforce that don't even understand an 8-hour day. It's like, you know, what's this 8-hour thing? You know, I work 2 or 3 hours in a focused way, and then I work on something else, and I'll work into the evening, but I don't have an 8-hour solid day in my consciousness, and that could be a real difference. And there's also somewhat of an entitlement that's showing up in younger workers who were brought up in, you know, sports where everybody gets a trophy no matter whether you won or lost or, you know, came in last. It didn't matter. You know, everybody gets a trophy, and there's almost a sense of entitlement that says if I show up to work, I should be getting promoted. You know, it's not based on results. It's based on me just showing up and doing this, you know, and just, you know, working. So there's just different values that we need to consider as a challenge in the future. Organizational complexity due to mergers, globalization, and new technology, I find to be more and more of a challenging issue. This whole issue, how do we coordinate when we might be in multiple time zones? You know, we just completed or is winding down a project that was international, and this was one of the major factors, is they're needing to coordinate in Europe and Latin America and Asia with the U.S. and values are different, expectations are different, styles of working is different, and even the coordination and handoffs when you're dealing with that level of complexity becomes challenging. Not to mention the fact that there's competing priorities that are taking place, and when you have a merged organization, then you're dealing with culture changes and conflicts. So this is something that we're all needing to get better at. And then one other thing that we're also noticing is an increase in specialization. It's almost like we're bringing in experts that have a particular expertise, whether that's technical or technological. It's very specific. And the problem with that, while it's very good for that particular competency, it can increase the level of disconnect in the organization, because while I understand my technical focus, I don't necessarily understand how it impacts others in the organization, or how I can support others in the organization. There's almost, again, like this complete disconnect. So I don't know if you can resonate with any of those challenges. I'd be very curious, if you were to write in your that questions box, and I should, next time I'll do it as a survey, but I'd love to know how many of those challenges are you facing, and are there any other challenges that are not mentioned here that you're facing? I'd like to know about that, and maybe I can get some help from Kameen if you write something in on just what you're sharing with me, and I'll comment as we go. But these seem to be at least the ones that I'm seeing.
So Mark?
Yes.
We are getting some comments. Many of them are saying yes, all of them, or all 5, and expanding with less resources, and people are just resonating with those challenges.
Great. Thank you for that. Good. Well, then hopefully this, as we go forward, will be helpful. Let's take a look then at what the old paradigm, or what I should say is the current paradigm, because it's old because it, so much of it's a legacy, but because it's still current today, the old is the same as today. One of them involves culture, and there's a whole notion that culture is not directly linked to business results, or the way we even think of it isn't even accurate. This to me is a huge issue, because in my mind, your culture represents your behaviors, and your behaviors do in fact affect business results. A lot of times we think in terms of culture being values driven, and therefore we separate it from our business, and we say, okay, culture is the values and the people side of the organization, and the business results are about accomplishing commitments and keeping accountability. Well, in my mind, those two cannot be separated. That it's a link, and it's not a link in the old way of thinking, where, well, if people are happy, then we're going to get good business results. That simply is not true. It's like, yes, if people are unhappy, then certainly that's not going to help to get business results. They're going to do things that will be counterproductive. But just because people are happy, I've worked in organizations where people were extremely social, they liked each other. That didn't mean they were effective at teamwork. That didn't mean that they had high levels of accountability. So we've got to look at culture in a different way that links the culture to the business results, so that they're not kept separate. Another aspect of culture is that change management and culture change is disconnected. And this is a really critical factor, because I see a lot of change efforts focus mostly on, on the change itself. And so change management is all about how do we implement the new change. And it might involve training people on the new change, but it's not really looking at the culture in the way it either supports or detracts from the change. So you might have a change that's going to increase efficiency, but maybe your culture is into procrastination, and your culture is about, not completing things on time, etc. So you might have this whole change effort to improve efficiency, while at the same time your culture is doing everything opposite to that. So that to me is a real critical factor. The second part of that is that it's ultimately your culture that sustains whatever change effort you're doing. And so when you're not thinking about the culture when you make a change effort, you may get results for a while, but then it can easily go back to a sub-optimized change result because the culture, in fact, isn't supporting the change. So, and again, we'll talk more about what the new paradigm is and ways to solve that, but to me, those are some things to really start to look at. And then there's this notion, I just had this come up with a client very recently where they said, well, we want to change, the way leaders are leading this organization. We have new sets of expectation for leaders about how they're going to be making decisions more and solving problems more and, and developing their people more, but we don't want to change the culture because, almost had this thing like changing the culture meant something was wrong with the old culture or that there's something wrong with their old values. And that is simply, an erroneous way of thinking about culture. And you're going to see when we get to the new paradigm how we want to think about that differently. Changing a culture does not mean something's wrong with the old culture. So we'll look at that a little bit in more depth. Another old paradigm thinking is that accountability is equal to keeping commitments. And that's such a minimal view about what accountability is. It's the problem is it possible to keep commitments and still not achieve your business results? And the answer to that is yes. So really, what do you want people to be accountable for? Just keeping commitments? Or do you want people to be accountable for getting the results? And so often, what I'm finding is we're overcommitting. Like we'll commit to things that there's no way we can do it, and so there's then no way we can be accountable. And so this implies a real trap in the way we think about accountability that that leads to paralysis, quite honestly. And I'll explain more about that as we go on as well. And then the fifth old paradigm is that improving performance depends on streamlining process and developing skills. I see most efforts today in organizations still in the old mindset of let's find better ways to improve processes. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing that, and that's great. And you've got your lean programs, and you've got your Six Sigma programs, and you've got your, continuous improvement, and all that's fine. And I'm not against any of that. And on the other side of the equation, we have developing, like if there's problems, let's do training programs to fix it. Gee, we're having difficulties in our communication and having honest conversations, so let's bring in a program on, having difficult conversations or crucial conversations or whatever, and we do training programs to improve performance. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. We all need greater skill. We all need better processes. But I have to tell you, that's still missing one major aspect of how performance needs to be improved. And we're even finding in some cases we're still investing lots of time in improved processes, but only getting a 2 to 4% return on that investment, as opposed to the 10 to 15 years ago where we get a 20, 30, even 40% return on that investment. We've just there's just not that much more to get in terms of process improvement in some organizations. Now, again, that may not be yours, but there's a whole other aspect of organizational performance that needs to be addressed if we're going to rise our performance standards and our expectations, and it goes beyond process improvement and developing skill. Continuing on here, buy-in is necessary for successful change effort. Now, this is hopefully an old concept. I still find some organizations attached to this, but buy-in is clearly not necessary for successful change effort. Involvement is, but not necessarily buy-in. In fact, I don't even, when we implement change efforts, we don't even go for buy-in at the beginning of a change. We're talking about the context for the change. We're talking about the external drivers that we need to respond to for a change, But it's not a matter of getting people's buy-in. It's much more about getting their involvement, and then when we see the change work and we get measurable results, then we go for the buy-in. So this can just cause an extra level of paralysis for some organizations that think that they need to have buy-in first. And this kind of goes along with it, having a perfect plan for change is necessary for a successful change. Again, not true. You know, really more important than having a perfect plan is your ability to recover and make adjustments while the change is going on in a successful and aligned way, because none of us can predict, you know, the future of a change. None of us knows what we don't know. We've never done those changes before. Therefore, it requires a lot of adaptability and flexibility, which is, to me, a core competency. And then training people on the change is preparing them to be successful implementing the change. Yeah, that's a part of it, but that's not going to help them be completely successful if you haven't addressed the cultural factors around expectations, relationships, and roles and responsibilities associated with that training, or rather with that change effort. So yeah, you can train people on the specifics of the new technology that you're introducing or the new structure that's being implemented, but if you're not also preparing the culture in the form of how are we going to change our behaviors to support this change effort, then they still may not be successful in the change. Moving right along here to some of the common traps we see, and I bet many of you can relate to these. Everything is a priority. That to me is still so prevalent today. And I see organizations go through these massive efforts to prioritize and set up their, top 4 or 5 priorities or whatever number it is, and then they make exceptions all throughout the rest of the year. And it's, oh yes, but this has to be done. Oh yes, but this has to be done. And there's just even a whole notion about what does it even mean to have a priority that I think is causing a lot of confusion for people in the workplace. Accountability has become activity-driven, resulting in higher levels of micromanagement. I just find this is one of the major plagues of organizations today, is we become very activity-driven, not outcome-driven. And it's all about having perfect project plans and making sure we have all the right steps, even though we can't resource it and we don't have the time to do it all, but we've set up these really nice plans that we end up failing in, and then we wonder why we can't keep our schedule. It's just, and I've even seen it where vice presidents in meetings are having meetings and doing it as a checkoff list. Okay, did you do this? Did you do that task? Is this task completed? And I'm like, wow, you're a vice president and you're sitting there, managing tasks of your direct reports. If that isn't micromanagement, I don't know what is. And it's because there's so much activity and we've got so many things going on that's sort of what it's amounted to. And it's gotten worse since the economic collapse 3.5 years ago, rather than better. You'd think that we'd become more outcome driven, but we haven't. We've become more activity driven. Shared ownership is avoided for fear of consensus decision making. There's so much fear around, we don't want to do things by consensus, so we always then assign an owner to a particular project or task, but then by assigning that owner, everybody else involved is kind of hands off. We don't need to deal with that because that person owns it. And so it creates this silo fragmentation, and shared ownership has nothing to do with consensus decision making. What shared ownership is that we all have a stake in those top priorities being successful, and we get involved in the problem solving associated with that. That's the ownership. You have shared ownership on any athletic team, music group, dance company. That's all shared ownership. Yeah, we all have to play our role and our part. No one's going to, play my musical instrument, but we have a shared ownership that if I'm having trouble, I get assistance from my team members to make sure that my performance improves. The purpose of functional leaders is to optimize functional performance. This again is a very common trap in organizations where we see functional leaders doing everything to make their function effective at the cost of the organization. Let me just give you a quick example of that. I worked with an organization. This is going to affect a lot of the traps and a lot of the old paradigm all in this one story. And this one particular department set up a goal for themselves to streamline their process. in their particular functional area. And they spent, set up a whole task force, did this whole major effort, and literally streamlined their process to the tune of impacting a savings to the organization of $500,000, which was a huge savings. It was a great improvement. They got awards at the end of the year, and everyone's cheering for this group who went through this massive process improvement effort. So yes, they did process improvement. Yes, they were very accountable, only to find that in the next year, that by them changing that process, it negatively impacted 5 other functional departments and cost the organization $1.7 million. So here you have this, again, silo thinking where we improve the process. It's all for our functional area, but negatively impacts the organization. And yes, they were accountable. See, and that's, again, where are you accountable for, just keeping commitments? Well, they did that, but they weren't accountable for the ultimate result, which was for the organization. So I wonder how many times you've seen that in some of your organizations. There's a great quote. I'm sure many of you have seen this, but I'm always reminding myself of this because I also don't want to get stuck in my old way of thinking. The significant problems we face cannot be solved at the same level of thinking we were at when we created the problems. So we have to think in a different way. We have to try new ways of dealing with change. And that's what I want to get into and really focus on in this next part. First of all, are there any questions up to this point? Because I'm going to change gears and get into the new paradigm. But if there are any questions about the old, and I just want to acknowledge that one person said a challenge for 2013 is a union workforce, which I would also agree that that's, we are dealing with some challenges in that area as well.
Right, Mark. We also had a comment that leaders of the future are not necessarily the successful attributes of the past. And, for example, openness for feedback versus being all-knowing. So changes in the landscape for leaders, for himself or herself, let alone the landscape itself. So
I think that's a great comment, actually. I do, and I think that we all need to take a look at that, is what does need to change in the future compared to the past, because what did create success in the past won't necessarily create success in the future. And part of what I'm going to be presenting will get into that and where to begin to look at that. So there's actually a strategy for re-looking at that. So I'm really glad that person brought that up. Thank you.
There's also a comment that in their organization, that specialists in the organization are not thought to be the experts, so outside consultants are brought in who don't understand the contracts or the culture.
That's a great comment. I love that comment. And that is so true, is that, we'll bring in outside experts, and obviously I'm one of those outside experts at times. I'm being brought in, to an organization, but one of the things that I'm just so sensitive to is that, just to apply my expertise without understanding context, without understanding history, without understanding implications, is again that myopic view that I think is very dangerous to organizations, and it's just another form of silo thinking. Great comment. I really appreciate you saying that. I think it's a big issue. Thank you. So let's take a look at the new paradigm. And first I'm going to start with just the context for it. So obviously the thing that we're all in business to do is achieve customer satisfaction and achieve business results. I mean, that's the bottom line for everything we do. And in order to do that, we have to identify a set of deliverables to achieve that. And there's 2 kinds of deliverables, which I find is part of the confusion around priorities. So the one kind of deliverable is what 80 to 90% of our focus is, and that's just simply serving customers, producing results, whatever that is on a day-to-day basis. And for those, there's always a clear set of priorities, if you will, but they're more like priority themes as opposed to priority projects. And that would include customer satisfaction, it can include safety, efficiency and productivity. It can include, equipment maintenance, and it can include, those things that are necessary to run the business. And there's, again, like I said, there's, that's going to be 80 to 90%, and we'll call those priorities, but they're really focus areas. Then there's the 10 to 20% of deliverables that are specific projects to take the organization from where it is today to some future state of greater excellence. And those will be project initiatives that might be bringing in new technology. It might be enhancing your equipment. It could be that you're going to do develop new leaders. It could be, any project that's, again, enhancement oriented. Now, some of those projects might come from your 80 to 90%. So let's say we have a problem with safety. Well, we may make safety a project for this year to improve that standard, to which at the end of the year, we're going to bring it back into the 80 to 90% for maintenance and sustainability. But always we set up these projects as very specific, has efforts that have a beginning and an end to achieve a particular outcome that we can measure. And then it goes back into maintenance for ongoing, sustainability. So that's in one place where I see confusion happen. Now, to achieve those deliverables, we have to execute. Execution involves what people are doing to produce results. Now, what they're doing may involve a process, and it's certainly going to apply skills. But the problem with execution is that you can have great process and great skill and still not be effective at execution, because you may be off in your coordination, your timing, your problem solving, your proactive recovery, and all of those things affect how you actually implement process and apply skill. And that's the area that's missing for most organizations. We're putting all this effort in process improvement, but then at the end of the day, we're not coordinating between our different groups, or, coordinating between our different priorities, and we have these conflicting priorities that, cause breakdown and distraction, and, the process in one department is different than the process in another department, and all of those linkages still can break down, even though you might have, effective processes, or you've got people that are really skilled. So to me, the execution and the part of this that's critical is that execution typically represents your habits. So we have habits around decision making, and you can send people to a class on decision making skill, but you still may have the habit that we don't involve people that are affected by a decision when we make a decision. Sometimes we make a decision and then consistently rehash that decision afterwards, never really accepting it. So those are the real causes of the breakdown, and no amount of training is going to help, and process improvement never touches that. And then we try and proceduralize decision making, but that just gets us bogged down in procedure and doesn't really affect the very issue of the habit that's driving it. And that's what we need to begin to address. The other factor is relationships. Now, relationships have always been thought of, again, as separate from business results, but that's because we're treating them separate. In fact, relationships are directly linked to execution. So if we're going to have better coordination and better execution between us, that means we have to communicate a certain way, and we have to coordinate a certain way, and we have to trust each other and support each other. And those are all the things that are a factor in having effective execution. So we're not building relationships for the purpose of building relationships or for making people happy. What we're doing is we're building relationships in support of execution, and therefore it's very specific kinds of relationship building to the execution to support the achievement of deliverables. And the really nice thing about this is that now you can begin to see how culture is actually identified, because culture is your execution and your relationships. That is your culture, because that represents your behaviors. And think about all your cultural values are represented in how you execute. So are you executing with teamwork, with trust, And it's not a skill-building effort to build trust. It's like, how do we execute to know what we expect of each other, how we're going to coordinate, what happens when it breaks down, and that begins to build the trust. In fact, what we're finding out is that if we improve execution, relationships go up automatically. We may never even talk about trust or support, but we set up how we're going to support each other from an execution standpoint, and how we're going to do things together and setting up clear expectations, and all of a sudden you find, wow, people trust each other more, and we measure this. You know, people have higher levels of support, communication's improving. But we never went to a class on communication. We never went to a class on managing conflict, yet we're managing conflict 35, 40% better because we've worked out the execution around solving conflicts and dealing with problems and worked it out that way. So that to me is a real important factor. And if I now boil this down into some statements that represent the new paradigm, here's what that would look like. Culture is execution-based, the habits of an organization, and directly impacts business results. We just talked about that. Culture is what optimizes and ensures sustainable change efforts. So whenever you're implementing a change, you don't want to just know about the change effort, but what is the culture in terms of the execution necessary to optimize the change? What is it we need to be doing differently? How do we need to be looking at our role and responsibilities differently? How do we need to look at our relationships differently with this whatever change effort it is you're bringing about as a support for sustaining that change effort? And that's where we're seeing some very major improvements to the effectiveness of change efforts. Involvement in recovery plans replace analysis paralysis and buy-in while reducing resistance. So in other words, we don't reduce resistance by trying to gain buy-in. What we're doing to reduce resistance is giving people the context for the change. What was the purpose of it, not the benefit of it. Not how it's going to be good for you, but simply what's the business case for it. And then setting up a mindset that says we don't know how to do this perfectly. So we've set up recovery plans for how we might have to change midstream if things don't go the way we planned it. And guess what? You're part of that. You're involved in creating what those recovery plans are, because we don't, no one's going to get blamed if the thing doesn't work exactly the way we've planned it. We're just going to keep committed because the final outcome that we're going for is non-negotiable based on the external drivers that are affecting our business. And all of a sudden you see people line up and they're not resisting as much, and we don't get caught in paralysis trying to come up with the perfect plan. We just get moving on the change effort and adjust as we gain more experience and learn from how the change goes so that we can make adjustments quickly. Big rocks, and calling something a priority doesn't make it a priority. And I call it the big rocks because, that's a very important concept, but it's kind of been misused where people say, oh, we only have 4 priorities. It's customer satisfaction, financial health, safety, and, whatever, and people development, and it's like, well, those aren't priorities. Those are themes to which you now have, or buckets to which you now have, 15 or 16 projects inside of each one that needs to now be resourced and coordinated, and no one's giving you a sense of priority over that. So you're back to the same thing. Most organizations that we run into have somewhere between 35 and 60 top priorities. That's crazy. That does not provide a clear sense of direction. Now, are there 35 to 60 important things to be done? Absolutely. Maybe it's even higher than that. I've been in some organizations where it's over 100 things that need to be accomplished. And I'm not questioning that. But what priorities does is sets it apart that says that if I have 2 things to do, I know which one comes first. So by setting up, your top 8 priorities doesn't mean that you don't still have 100 things to get done. No, you still have to work on all those 100 things. But what it says is these 8 are the most important, and we're going to put special effort on those, and we're going to have, a unique level of ownership for those because those are the non-negotiables. And that gets us to the next bullet, which is senior management must retain shared ownership for your non-negotiable priorities. Instead of delegating that too soon, really it's senior management that if they're going to say these are the top 8, then they ought to have the ownership that says we ensure that these are successful, and we will work as a team in support of each other to make sure those are successful. And then what is their role? Problem solving. Their role is surfacing and resolving any obstacles or challenges, whether it's a resource issue, whether it is a conflicting priority issue, whether it is a timing issue, whatever it is the issue, that senior leadership team needs to then, take ownership for that and find ways to solve it, because the project teams themselves simply don't have the authority or the bandwidth or the scope, really, the authority to get involved with that level. Now, they're still solving 90%, the project management teams are solving, 90% of the problems, but there's still a 5 to 10% that the senior managers must get involved in to solve the big things that could cause breakdown. I just worked with a group literally just a few days ago that they said that if they had this major project and it got fragmented into 2 different, project teams that really didn't coordinate well, and it ended up to be a failed effort, that if they would have done this level of ownership at the beginning when they created the initial project plan and set up a system for monitoring the challenges, they could have avoided so much lost revenue and wasted resources on a failed effort, because they would have surfaced the problems at the beginning rather than in the middle. 6, the purpose of functional leaders is to optimize organizational performance, not functional performance. I mean, what a concept, right? But we hire directors of departments to optimize their department, and they're doing their optimization irrespective of the impact on the rest of the organization. And just like the story I told, they optimized their process, saving their department $500,000 and costing the organization $1.7 million. Well, it looks good on their budget, but unfortunately it's not serving the organization. And we have to change that mindset going forward, so that your top leaders are thinking in terms of the organization, not just in terms of their particular functional area. And then finally, accountability is equal to achieving desired outcomes and sustainable results. That's what I want to hold people accountable to. When you do that, it changes the game completely, because then when I'm delegating something to somebody, I'm not delegating a task, I'm delegating an outcome. And I let them know what the criteria for success is and get the agreement, the accountable agreement to the criteria of success. That way, I don't have to micromanage them. And yet at the same time, they can approach it in the way they want to. Now, your criteria might include that you be inclusive of other people, make sure to check in with these other departments. It can include levels of quality, levels of, detail, etc. But that's not micromanaging. That's just, giving them what the criteria of success is. They get to determine how they're going to do that. So, with that new, with that new paradigm, let's start taking a look at the results of the new paradigm. When you start thinking and reacting differently, business and financial challenges are resolved using the culture. So in other words, when there's a breakdown, you use the culture to solve it. If your culture is based on execution, let me just give you an example. One organization I worked with they had this major budget crisis, and they had to reduce their operating costs by $3.9 million within 3 months. But instead of senior management just doing a flat, reduction, they gave it to their 50 middle managers who we've been developing culturally to work as a unified team. So the 50 middle managers, and I know it's not, well, that's too high a number for a team, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, forget all the rules. Let's start looking at execution, because execution is irrespective of the rules and says, how do we need to get things done between us? So those 50 managers together started to share resources, started to reprioritize, and literally within that 3-month period reduced operating budget by $4.3 million, not just 3.9, 4.3 million, and at the same time developed a new revenue stream to add income to the organization. That was done through their teamwork. They didn't do any layoffs. They just simply, reprioritized, resourced, shared the resources differently, and that got the result. we want to start using the culture, if it's based on execution, to solve business challenges. What I see happen too often is the organization goes through financial crisis, and therefore we just stop our culture efforts and stop our development efforts and stop the people side because we've got to survive. Well, wait a minute. If the culture is supporting the business, let's use the culture to get the business result. Business results and culture execution are measured together and a new approach to scorecards. So I see a lot of scorecard processes being done in organizations that focus only on business results. But if you're thinking in terms of execution, then now you can measure execution that's going to be linked to business results. Why do you do that? Because execution happens faster than the business results. It's execution that achieves the business result. So you really want to look at it in terms of if we see an execution that's getting off track, let's fix that first before it impacts the business result. And therefore you can be a lot more responsive. Employee engagement, trust, and retention improve by focusing on execution linked to business results. You can't improve execution without involving the people. It's like, you know, when I played baseball, I had to be on the team in practice, practicing execution. It's not the coaches that are going to make that happen. It's not them making decisions. It's all of us working together. So by definition, working on execution is an engagement process, but it's all pointed towards how we set clear expectations with each other, coordinate with each other, support each other, all in service to the business results. When you see the business results improve and the execution improve at the same time, you have a winning combination. That's what we want to see achieved. I worked with 3 different departments in a manufacturing plant. It was a quality, maintenance, and operations that were so polarized they literally would attack each other when there was a problem, and not only throw it over the fence, but then, do whatever they could to make each other wrong. What we did was, instead of going into what their grievances were with each other, we just said, how would you guys need to coordinate and need to cooperate if you were to achieve the business challenges of the next year? And they themselves came up with, well, we would need to be more transparent, and we need to do joint problem solving, and we need to support each other. I go, great, let's start doing that. And 5 months later, after they, we took this into a whole process, 5 months later, they became the best performing plant instead of the worst. They had the highest morale instead of the lowest. But we all created that. We, literally one day of doing that, plus a little bit of follow-up to make sure they were keeping their commitments, and they got huge results fast. But it wasn't through programs on trust or programs on engagement. It was just doing it. And that's, to me, the real key for making successful changes in the new paradigm. Improved project performance, customer satisfaction, and profitability are sustained. So if we take a look at this in the old model that I showed you before, what we typically see in 6 to 9 months is execution improves 60 to 80%, relationships improve 15 to 35%, and deliverables include improved project performance, improved customer satisfaction, etc. So all of this gets measured, and now you've got culture. If you, again, think about it as execution plus relationships equal your culture, now you've got a way to not only measure it, but link it to your business results through your deliverables. Now all of a sudden we have integration in the organization, not separation. Not culture is a people issue and business results is a separate issue, but now they're all integrated together. One of the concepts that we want to, let people see is, and you've seen this if you've read my book on creating the accountable organization, but I want to add a new element to it, are the 5 levels of accountability. So you've got entitlement, you've got individual accountability, you've got work unit accountability, and cross-functional. Now, here's the key in this is, individual accountability is what most people think of as accountability, but you can be accountable for your job but not be supporting your team members. So that's where work unit accountability and functional accountability come into play. And we see most organizations here somewhere between 2 and 3. But this is where the big difference comes. In individual and work unit, you still have silo behavior. And one of the major differences is management is a vertical top-down process of optimizing the department's performance. And generally you do that by having a strong manager set clear expectations, set clear standards. The problem with that is that then you're not developing the critical thinking below in the organization, because when there's challenges or problems, it typically goes up to the director for resolution. So you still end up at some point of growth. While it's good at the beginning for getting better results, at some point the director who's in charge of making those decisions become the bottleneck, because everything, any problem, any disagreement, anything that's taking place in the organization must get back to the leader for final solution and decision making. Whereas when you cross over to cross-functional accountability, you now are managing horizontally as well as vertically. And again, this solves a couple of things. One is that now, as a director, I have to learn about the impact of my department on other departments. I have to begin getting involved in solving problems that occur in other departments because of my critical thinking ability to support that. And at the same time, if I'm doing that, then my direct reports have to have a higher level of vertical accountability in their leadership. So it now raises people to their next level, and you start developing future leaders. Also, what you're doing is developing the critical thinking below in your organization, and what you're really teaching directors to become are business leaders, not just functional leaders. And that, to me, is one of the big changes for addressing the challenges going forward into 2013. So how do we make that change, and what is that missing piece? And let me just go over kind of what happened, some questions for you to ask, and then and then of course organizational is the same. What's your level of accountability? Does middle management act as an aligned and unified team? If the answer is no, you by definition are not optimizing results. Do you experience breakdowns based on silo behavior? How much of your results depend on heroic efforts by a few? And there we become very dependent on those people. How deliberately are you developing critical thinking throughout the organization so people are learning to think as business leaders, not as just functional experts or specialists? So how does this all get played out? And I know I only have a few minutes, but I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. Cross-functional execution. Obviously, I've been talking a lot about that. It's the missing piece. But where does it fit in terms of organizational process? And I can do this very quickly. So most of us are very clear. We get, at the beginning of the year, we set up what our desired business results are, and we set up a strategy to accomplish it. The missing piece goes right here. What's the cross-functional execution necessary to support the strategy? How are we going to make decisions, share information, surface and resolve problems, resolve conflicts, deal with conflicting priorities, deal with resource issues? How does that happen? Based on the execution, we can then set up our processes and competencies. And this is where process improvement and training come into play. So there's still a major element, and they're very important. But without the cross-functional execution, what's it really supporting? And how do you measure it? And then, of course, there's relationships that need to support process, competencies, and execution. And then finally, you take action. So, and then from that action, you get results. But here's where the problem comes in. Most organizations do really well at the desired results and strategy, and then they immediately go into, okay, let's take action, let's set up our goals. And when that doesn't work, then we go to process and competency improvement and relationship building. and so really what you're doing now is you're improving processes as a reactive approach rather than a proactive approach. And guess one thing that we're completely leaving out is the cross-functional execution. That is where the habits of the organization are placed. So that's what we really want to correct. That's where you want to build it into your systems going forward. So what will you learn in rapid culture change? I do want to take a few minutes to talk about that. I've set up a lot of the content and some of the constructs, and I hope you got a chance to see some of the concepts that we do go over in much more detail in the Rapid Culture Change program. But one thing is how to strategize your biggest change efforts. So when you come into that workshop, we actually ask you to bring in your biggest challenges, and we're going to help you set up the strategy, and especially if those challenges you've tried to deal with before that didn't work, and you haven't had success with, we want those, because we're going to take those and give you a strategy that's going to be successful going forward. Part of what you learn in this program is to learn to adjust your culture to support business results and change efforts. And then improving your diagnostic skills for leveraging change and improvement efforts. So those are three major things that you learn when you come into that program. It's all about the diagnostic, really about making significant changes. When is the program happening? So some of you probably are thinking about, wait, what is this program? I haven't even heard about it. So it's January 21st, 22nd, and 23rd. It's in Marina Del Rey. Seats are limited to 16. It's a very intimate program. It's near LAX and really beautiful. Why attend? To learn to leverage your change efforts for faster results, practice strategies for breaking down silos, because that's what we're going to be doing mostly. Increase your influence as a change agent. That's the one thing we find is a common outcome. Gain effectiveness as a business partner to senior managers. That's critical. And learn methods for improving business results and morale at the same time. Who's it for? Senior leaders, HR directors, managers, change consultants, really anyone involved in a major change effort. So if that's you, you might consider that as a program. And again, just to review where it is and how to get to it is the website, the Rapid Culture Change. And there is early bird pricing, which is going to end soon. So hope that's helpful for that. I really don't have as much time for questions as I was hoping for. I do want to make sure that you get the how to set up 2013. So let me go through that, and with whatever time is remaining, I'll deal with questions afterwards. So step 1, clarify what the organization needs to accomplish by 2014. Always work backwards from the end state. And I put you in here is if you're trying to go for personal change, really where do you want to be at the end of 2014? We're coming on the end of 2013. Where do you want to be? And then back that up with what's that picture of success for execution for the different levels of leadership to optimize results. In other words, how would senior leadership need to function differently and execute differently to support that change? What would middle management need to do to support that change? What would supervisors need to do to support that change? What would the lower levels need to do, the individual contributors? And I look at them as leaders as well, by the way. So that you have a real clear picture of what would it look like if we're successful in 2014 in terms of behaviors. Not outcomes, but just in terms of behaviors and what we're accomplishing. Then clarify the desired habit changes involving decision-making, information sharing, employee engagement, surfacing and solving problems, and on and on and on. It's those key habits that's going to leverage the change. That's the key issue here. What are those habits that we just absolutely have to replace with new habits to leverage our change efforts? Then target the most important level to leverage the change even further. So you can't work with the whole, doing a culture change or a major change effort does not involve necessarily including everybody. We generally leverage middle managers in most of our change efforts, sometimes senior managers, to make those significant changes. Let's look at what their habits are, and that will affect everybody else. Create a plan for change where interdependent leaders change their habits of execution by creating new habits and measurements. So you can measure habit changes by tracking them. That's the main way to measure those. And then finally, develop a strategy and business case for making the change to ensure your effort is resourced. There's a great quote by Michelangelo that I don't find has been publicized all that much. The greater danger for most of us lies not in setting our aim too high and falling short, but in setting our aim too low and achieving our mark.